shy waitress, a deaf woman, a simple thank you in sign language. But what if that one moment of kindness unlocked something much bigger? What if it changed the heart of a man who had built his life around silence and shadows? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in steady sheets across Boston's cobblestone streets, transforming the gaslit thoroughfares into rivers of amber light and shadow. It was the autumn of 1902, and Detective Thomas Aldridge stood beneath the awning of Murphy's Café, watching the downpour with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much darkness in his 32 years. His tall frame, broad-shouldered and imposing even in civilian clothes, cast a long shadow across the wet pavement. He had the kind of presence that turned heads, with sharp features softened only by intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing. Thomas had spent the past 14 hours pursuing leads on a missing persons case that had gone cold 3 days prior. A wealthy merchant's daughter had vanished from her family's Beacon Hill mansion without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic note that read, "Seek the truth where silence speaks loudest." The case had consumed him, as all mysteries did, but his mother had insisted he take time for a proper meal before returning to the precinct. He pushed open the cafe door, the brass bell above announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the somber evening. The interior was warm and inviting, with burgundy velvet curtains drawn against the storm and gas lamps casting a golden glow over the dozen or so occupied tables. The scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee filled the air, mingling with the subtle aroma of beef stew that reminded Thomas of simpler times. His mother, Eleanor Aldridge, sat at their usual corner table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the weather. At 63, she maintained the dignified bearing of her youth, though the silence that had claimed her hearing 5 years ago had left her somewhat isolated from the bustling world around her. She smiled when she saw Thomas, her blue eyes lighting up with the same warmth they had held throughout his childhood. As Thomas approached, he noticed their server for the evening, a young woman he had never seen before at Murphy's. She stood by the kitchen door, notepad clutched nervously in her delicate hands, her posture suggesting someone who wished to disappear into the wallpaper. She was strikingly beautiful in an understated way, with chestnut hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed a graceful neck and high cheekbones dusted with the faintest rose. Her dark green eyes, large and expressive, darted about the room like a frightened doe, never quite settling on any one thing for long. She wore the standard server's uniform of white blouse and long black skirt, but something about the way she carried herself suggested this was new territory for her. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached a nearby table, and when an older gentleman spoke to her, she seemed to shrink back before nodding quickly and hurrying away without a word. Thomas took his seat across from his mother, who immediately began signing to him. Her hands moved with practiced grace, forming the language that had become their bridge across the silent divide. "You look exhausted, Thomas. Please tell me you've made progress on the Whitmore case." Thomas signed back, his larger hands moving with surprising fluidity. "Nothing substantial, Mother. The trail grows colder by the hour, but I promised you dinner, and a promise to you is sacred." Eleanor's expression softened with maternal concern. "You push yourself too hard, my darling boy. Even the sharpest mind needs rest." Before Thomas could respond, the shy waitress approached their table, her steps hesitant as if she were walking across thin ice. Up close, Thomas could see that her beauty was even more remarkable, though it seemed she was completely unaware of it. There was an intelligence in her eyes that belied her nervous demeanor, and something about the way she held herself suggested hidden depths. She placed 2 glasses of water on their table with shaking hands, nearly spilling one before steadying it. Her cheeks flushed pink with embarrassment, and she quickly retrieved her notepad, her eyes fixed firmly on the paper rather than meeting either of their gazes. Eleanor signed to Thomas, her movements slow and deliberate so the young woman might see. "Is this establishment service always so timid, or have they hired a mouse?" Thomas suppressed a smile, but before he could translate his mother's jest, something extraordinary happened. The waitress's eyes had followed Eleanor's hands, and for just a moment, recognition flickered across her features. She glanced between Thomas and his mother, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding, and then to something that looked remarkably like determination. Setting down her notepad, the young woman lifted her own hands and began to sign, her movements careful but unmistakable. Good evening, ma'am. My name is Clara. I apologize for my nervousness. This is my first week here. May I take your order? The transformation on Eleanor's face was instantaneous. Her eyes widened with delighted surprise, and tears suddenly glistened in them. In all the years since losing her hearing, rarely did strangers make the effort to communicate with her directly. Most simply spoke louder, as if volume could penetrate her silent world, or addressed their comments to Thomas as if she were invisible. Thomas himself was stunned into momentary silence, watching this unexpected exchange unfold. The shy waitress who couldn't meet anyone's eyes was signing to his mother with genuine consideration and respect. Eleanor signed back, her hands moving with renewed energy. Clara, what a beautiful name. You sign very well. Where did you learn? Clara's cheeks flushed deeper, but there was a small, tentative smile playing at her lips now. Her hands moved again, more confidently this time. My younger brother Samuel. He lost his hearing to scarlet fever when he was 6. I've been signing with him for 10 years now. He's 16 and quite the troublemaker. Her smile grew slightly warmer as she mentioned her brother, the first genuine expression Thomas had seen cross her face. How wonderful, Eleanor signed, beaming, to have a sister who learned for him. He is blessed, and so are we, to have met you tonight. Thomas found himself studying Clara with new interest. Beneath the timid exterior was someone with compassion and dedication, someone who had learned an entire language out of love for her brother. He wondered what other surprises lay hidden behind those guarded eyes. Clara ducked her head slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. But when she looked up again, her gaze accidentally met Thomas's for the first time. In that brief moment of contact, he felt something shift in the air between them, like the instant before lightning strikes. Her eyes widened, and she quickly looked away, but not before he caught a glimpse of something that might have been curiosity mixed with her shyness. Forgive my rudeness, Thomas said aloud, then signed simultaneously for his mother's benefit. I'm Thomas Aldridge, and this is my mother, Eleanor. We're very grateful for your kindness toward her. Clara nodded quickly, retrieving her notepad with trembling fingers once more. When she spoke, her voice was soft and musical, barely above a whisper. It's no kindness, sir. Simply common courtesy. Now, what may I bring you both this evening? Eleanor ordered the beef stew, and Thomas requested the same along with fresh bread and coffee. As Clara hurried away to place their order, Eleanor turned to her son with an expression of such profound joy that it made Thomas's chest tighten with emotion. Thomas, she signed, that young woman has given me something I haven't felt in years. She saw me, truly saw me, not as a burden or an obstacle, but as a person worth speaking to in my own language. I felt human again. Thomas reached across the table and took his mother's hands gently in his own. Mother, you are the most human person I know. Anyone who cannot see that is blind in ways that have nothing to do with physical senses. You're my son. You're required to think that, Eleanor signed with a teasing smile, but her eyes were still bright with unshed tears. As they waited for their meal, Thomas found his attention repeatedly drawn to Clara as she moved through the café. She served other tables with the same nervous efficiency, rarely speaking more than necessary, often communicating through nods and gestures. But when she returned to check on an elderly couple at a corner table, Thomas noticed the woman was using a cane and appeared to have difficulty reading the menu in the dim light. Without hesitation, Clara knelt beside the woman's chair, holding the menu at a better angle and patiently describing each dish in her soft voice until the woman made her selection. Small acts of consideration, Thomas noted. This wasn't performance or duty, it was simply who Clara was when she thought no one was watching. When Clara returned with their meals, she set them down with visible relief that she hadn't spilled anything. But as she turned to leave, Eleanor reached out and gently touched her arm. Clara turned back, and Eleanor signed to her. Thank you, Clara, not just for the food, but for seeing me. Clara's eyes filled with sudden tears that she quickly blinked away. Her hands lifted to sign back. Thank you for allowing me to practice. I don't often meet others who sign. It makes me feel closer to Samuel when I do. Does your brother live with you? Eleanor asked through her signs. Clara nodded, then signed. Yes, ma'am. With our mother as well. Our father passed 3 years ago. We manage a small boarding house on Hanover Street. She paused, then added, Samuel is incredibly bright. He reads constantly and dreams of attending university someday, though I'm not sure how we'll manage the expense. Thomas watched this exchange with growing fascination. Clara was opening up to his mother in a way she clearly didn't with most people. The signing seemed to create a private space of trust, a sanctuary from the watchful eyes and judgment of the world around them. "He will find his way," Eleanor signed with conviction. "Goodness and determination have a way of attracting opportunity. You're a testament to that yourself." Clara smiled, a real smile this time that transformed her entire face, and Thomas felt his heart perform an unexpected somersault in his chest. When she smiled like that, unself-conscious and genuine, she was absolutely radiant. "I should return to work," Clara signed apologetically. "Please enjoy your meal and let me know if you need anything." As she walked away, Eleanor turned to Thomas with a knowing look that mothers throughout history have perfected. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Thomas focused intently on his stew, avoiding his mother's penetrating gaze. "She seems very kind, yes." "Thomas Henry Aldridge," Eleanor signed with exaggerated patience. "I raised you. I know when something has caught your attention beyond mere professional courtesy." "A mother," Thomas signed back, fighting a smile. "I've known her for approximately 15 minutes. Hardly enough time to form any significant impressions beyond acknowledging her kindness to you. And yet, you've looked in her direction no fewer than 7 times since she left our table," Eleanor observed with amusement dancing in her eyes. Thomas had no adequate response to that, so he simply applied himself to his meal with more concentration than it strictly required. But his mother was right, as she usually was. There was something about Clara that had captured his attention, in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the contrast between her timid exterior and the quiet strength she showed when signing with his mother. Perhaps it was the dedication that learning sign language for her brother implied. Or perhaps it was simply the way her eyes had met his for that brief instant, and the world had seemed to pause. The evening continued peacefully, with Thomas and his mother enjoying their meal and quiet conversation through signs. Clara checked on them periodically, each time exchanging a few signed words with Eleanor, who was clearly delighting in the interaction. Thomas noticed that Clara seemed to relax incrementally with each visit to their table, as if the signing created a safe space for her. As they finished their coffee, a commotion arose near the café entrance. The door burst open, admitting not only a gust of wind and rain, but also a man in an expensive but rain-soaked coat. He was perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the ruddy complexion of someone who had been running through the storm. "Is there a police detective here?" he called out loudly, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. "I was told Detective Aldridge frequents this establishment." Thomas stood immediately, his professional instincts engaged. "I'm Detective Aldridge. What's happened?" The man rushed toward him, water dripping from his coat onto the cafe floor. "Thank God. I'm Gerald Whitmore. My daughter, Lydia. You're searching for her." "Mr. Whitmore, yes. I recognize you from the precinct. Has there been a development?" "This arrived at my home less than an hour ago." Whitmore thrust a damp envelope at Thomas. "Another note, Detective. But this one is different. It mentions a location, I think, but it makes no sense to me." Thomas carefully extracted the note, mindful of preserving any potential evidence. The paper was expensive stock, the same as the first note, and the handwriting matched. But this message was indeed different. "The silent witness holds the key. Where the lost find voice, truth awaits in the third shadow." He read it twice, his mind already working through possible interpretations. The silent witness, where the lost find voice, third shadow. It was a riddle, clearly, but one designed to lead someone somewhere. Thomas studied the cryptic message while Mr. Whitmore paced anxiously beside their table, his wet shoes squeaking against the polished wooden floor. Eleanor watched the exchange with concern, unable to hear the conversation, but clearly sensing its urgency from the body language of both men. "Mr. Whitmore," Thomas said carefully, "I need you to tell me everything about how this note was delivered. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem." The older man ran a trembling hand through his thinning gray hair. "It was slipped under our front door. My wife found it when she went to check if the rain had stopped. No one saw who delivered it, Detective. Our butler was in the back of the house and the maids were upstairs. It just appeared." Thomas examined the envelope more closely, holding it up to the lamplight. The paper was identical to the first ransom note, expensive and watermarked, the kind sold at only a few stationers in Boston. But there was something else, a faint impression on the envelope's surface, as if something had been pressed against it. "May I keep this?" Thomas asked, though it was more statement than question. Of course, anything that might help find Lydia. She's been gone 4 days now, Detective. 4 days, and we don't know if she's safe, if she's frightened, if she's... Whitmore's voice broke, and he couldn't finish the thought. We will find her, Mr. Whitmore. I give you my word. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. Go home to your wife. She needs you now, and I promise I'm working every angle. After Whitmore departed, leaving a trail of rainwater in his wake, Thomas returned to the table where his mother waited with questions written plainly across her face. He signed to her quickly, explaining the situation while his mind continued to work through the riddle. Eleanor read the note when he showed it to her, her expression thoughtful. The silent witness, she signed slowly. Thomas, could that refer to someone who cannot speak? Someone like me? Or like Clara's brother? Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. His mother had just made a connection he should have seen immediately. Mother, you're brilliant. Of course. The silent witness, where the lost find voice. It could be referring to a school or institution for the deaf. There's the Boston School for the Deaf on Beacon Street, Eleanor signed. I visited there once, years ago, when I was first learning to navigate my new world. But what does the third shadow mean? Thomas was about to respond when he noticed Clara standing a few feet away, having approached so quietly that neither of them had heard her. Her face was pale, and she was staring at the note in Thomas's hand with an expression that could only be described as recognition mixed with fear. Clara? Thomas said gently, rising from his chair. Are you all right? She seemed to snap out of her trance, blinking rapidly. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to intrude. I was coming to ask if you needed anything else, but I couldn't help but see the note. Her voice was even softer than usual, barely a whisper. Do you recognize something about it? Thomas asked, his detective's instincts fully engaged now. Clara hesitated, her hands twisting together nervously. She glanced around the café as if checking who might be listening, then signed to Eleanor while speaking quietly to Thomas, including both of them in her answer. The third shadow. It's something my brother Samuel told me about. There's a garden at the Boston School for the Deaf, and in the afternoon, 3 large oak trees cast shadows across a particular bench. The students call it the third shadow because it's the darkest of the 3, where they go when they want privacy. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. How does Samuel know about this? He attends classes there twice a week, Clara explained, her fingers still trembling as she signed. The school offers evening instruction for working young people who are deaf. Samuel works during the day at a print shop, but he's desperate to continue his education. The school has been wonderful for him. Clara, this is extremely important, Thomas said, keeping his tone calm despite the urgency he felt. Have you or Samuel noticed anything unusual at the school recently? Anyone who doesn't belong there? Or any strange occurrences? Clara's eyes widened with understanding. This note, it's about the missing girl, isn't it? The one in the newspapers? Miss Lydia Whitmore? Thomas nodded. I cannot share details of an active investigation, but yes, any information you might have could be crucial. Clara bit her lower lip, thinking hard. When she signed and spoke again, her words came more quickly, as if urgency had temporarily overridden her shyness. Samuel mentioned something 3 days ago. He said he'd seen a young woman in the garden, someone who wasn't a student. She was sitting on the bench at the third shadow, and she looked distressed. He tried to approach her to see if she needed help, but a man appeared, an older gentleman in fine clothes, and they left together. Samuel thought perhaps she was just a visitor meeting her father. Can you describe this man? Thomas pressed. Samuel said he was tall, with gray hair and a walking stick with a silver handle. He wore expensive clothes, a dark coat with a fur collar. Samuel remembered because the man seemed irritated when he noticed Samuel watching them. Thomas's mind raced. This description didn't match anyone connected to the Whitmore case that he knew of, but it was the first concrete lead he'd had in days. Clara, I need to speak with Samuel as soon as possible. Would he be willing to meet with me tonight? Clara glanced at the cafe's clock on the wall. It was nearly 8 o'clock. He should be home from the print shop by now. I finish my shift at 9. I could take you to our boarding house then if you'd like. Mother will be awake and Samuel never goes to bed before 10. That would be extremely helpful, thank you. Thomas turned to his mother, who had been following the conversation through their signs and his spoken words. Mother, I should escort you home first. Eleanor shook her head firmly, her hands moving with decisive emphasis. Absolutely not. I'm coming with you to meet this young man. I want to help. and perhaps Samuel will feel more comfortable speaking with another deaf person present. Thomas knew better than to argue when his mother used that particular expression. Besides, she was probably right about Samuel being more at ease with her there. "Very well, Mother. Clara, we'll wait for you to finish your shift." The next hour passed slowly for Thomas, though he used the time productively, studying the note again and making observations in his leather-bound notebook. Eleanor struck up a signed conversation with an elderly deaf gentleman who had been dining alone, delighted to have found another person to communicate with. Thomas watched his mother's animated conversation and felt a surge of gratitude toward Clara for the simple act of kindness that had brought such joy to Eleanor's evening. Clara moved through her remaining duties with slightly less nervousness now, though Thomas noticed she kept glancing in their direction, as if assuring herself they were still there. Each time their eyes met accidentally, she would quickly look away, but not before Thomas caught something in her expression, a mixture of concern and something else he couldn't quite identify. When 9 o'clock finally arrived, Clara emerged from the back room wearing a simple gray coat and a modest hat. She had removed her apron and looked even younger now, perhaps 23 or 24, Thomas estimated. She approached their table with her usual hesitant steps. "I'm ready whenever you are," she said softly, then signed the same to Eleanor. The three of them ventured out into the rainy Boston night. Thomas held an umbrella large enough to shelter all of them, though it required walking quite close together. Clara led them through the maze of streets toward Hanover Street, navigating the wet cobblestones with practiced ease despite the darkness and rain. The North End at night was a world unto itself. Gas lamps created islands of golden light in the darkness, and despite the weather, the streets were far from empty. Working men hurried home to their families, shop owners shuttered their establishments for the night, and from open windows came the sounds of life. Babies crying, couples arguing, someone playing a violin with more enthusiasm than skill. Clara's boarding house was a narrow 3-story brick building squeezed between a bakery and a tailor's shop. The windows glowed with warm light, and even from the street Thomas could smell something delicious cooking, perhaps vegetable soup or stew. "It's not much," Clara said apologetically as she unlocked the front door, "but it's home." They entered a small but immaculately clean foyer. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and several landscape paintings, clearly amateur but earnest efforts, hung in simple frames. A coat rack stood by the door, and a narrow staircase led to the upper floors. "Mother, Samuel, I'm home and I've brought guests," Clara called out, then immediately signed for the benefit of her brother. A woman emerged from what Thomas assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with the same delicate features as Clara, but with silver threading through her chestnut hair. Her expression was warm but cautious as she took in the strangers in her foyer. "Mother, this is Detective Thomas Aldridge and his mother, Mrs. Eleanor Aldridge. They need to speak with Samuel about something important. Detective Aldridge, this is my mother, Mrs. Margaret Brennan." Margaret's eyes widened slightly at the word detective, but she maintained her composure. "A detective? Is Samuel in some kind of trouble?" "Not at all, Mrs. Brennan," Thomas assured her quickly. "Your son may have witnessed something relevant to a case I'm investigating. I simply need to ask him a few questions." Before Margaret could respond, a young man appeared at the top of the stairs. Samuel Brennan was 16 but looked older, with the kind of serious expression that came from taking on adult responsibilities too young. He was tall and lanky, still growing into his frame, with his sister's same expressive eyes and his mother's strong features. When he saw the gathering in the foyer, he descended the stairs with quick, eager steps. Clara immediately began signing to him, her hands moving rapidly as she explained the situation. Thomas watched Samuel's expression transform from curiosity to understanding, to something like excitement. When Clara finished, Samuel turned to Thomas and Eleanor and signed with impressive clarity and speed. Eleanor translated his signs aloud for Thomas and the others. "He says he's happy to help however he can. He's been worried about the missing girl since he saw her picture in the newspaper." They moved into the modest parlor, where Margaret served tea despite the late hour. The room was small but cozy, with worn but comfortable furniture, and more of those earnest landscape paintings on the walls. Thomas noticed a stack of books on a side table, their spines showing titles on subjects ranging from American history to advanced mathematics. Samuel settled into a chair across from Thomas, his posture straight and attentive. Eleanor sat beside Thomas, ready to translate, while Clara hovered near her brother, clearly protective of him. Margaret remained in the doorway, watching everything with a mother's concerned vigilance. Samuel, Thomas began, with Eleanor signing his words. I understand you saw a young woman at the school 3 days ago, in the garden at the third shadow. Can you tell me everything you remember about her? Samuel's hands moved with precision and eloquence as he signed, and Eleanor translated. I was leaving my evening class around 6 o'clock. It was starting to get dark, but there's a gas lamp near the garden, so I could see well enough. I noticed her because she seemed out of place. She wasn't wearing the kind of simple dress our students wear. Her clothes were expensive, silk and lace. She was sitting on the bench at the third shadow, and she was crying. Could you see her face clearly? Thomas asked. Samuel nodded, then continued signing. Yes, when she looked up. She was very pretty, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked about 18 or 19. I thought perhaps she was lost or upset about something, so I started to walk toward her to see if she needed help. That's when the man appeared, Thomas prompted. Yes, Samuel signed, his expression growing troubled. He seemed to come from nowhere, just suddenly there beside her. At first, I thought he might be her father because he was older, maybe 50 or 55, but the way he gripped her arm, it didn't seem fatherly. It seemed controlling. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Did you see them leave? Which direction did they go? They walked toward the street, to a carriage that was waiting. It was a fancy carriage, black with brass fittings, pulled by 2 gray horses. The man helped her inside, but again it felt wrong somehow. She didn't resist, but she didn't seem willing either, if that makes sense. She just seemed resigned. Did you see the driver? Thomas asked. Samuel shook his head. The driver wore a long coat and a hat pulled low. I couldn't see his face. And you said the man had a walking stick with a silver handle? Yes, very distinctive. The handle was shaped like a wolf's head. I remember because when he noticed me watching, he tapped it against his leg, like a warning or a threat. Thomas felt the pieces beginning to align in his mind, though the picture they formed was still incomplete. He pulled out his notebook and sketched quickly based on Samuel's description. The man, did he look like this? He showed the rough sketch to Samuel. Samuel studied it carefully, then signed. The face is close, but he had a scar, a small one here. He indicated his left temple. Thomas added the detail to his sketch. This man, whoever he was, had Lydia Whitmore, or at least had 3 days ago. But why meet at the school for the deaf? What was the connection? Samuel, Eleanor signed, speaking aloud so everyone could follow. Did the woman, the girl, did she sign at all? Did she try to communicate with you? Samuel's expression changed, becoming more animated. Yes, that's what was so strange. When she first saw me approaching, before the man arrived, she started to sign. Just 2 words, help me. But then the man appeared, and she stopped immediately, as if she were afraid of him seeing her do it. The room fell silent as the implications of this sank in. Thomas's mind was racing now. Lydia Whitmore could sign. There had been nothing in any of the family's statements about this. Why would a wealthy merchant's daughter know sign language? Clara spoke up softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective, may I say something? Of course, Clara, please. She twisted her hands together nervously but continued. Samuel teaches sign language to some of the younger children at the school, the ones who are just learning. He's very patient with them. About 2 months ago, there was a young woman who started attending some of the beginner classes. She said she wanted to learn to communicate with her cousin who had lost her hearing. Samuel helped tutor her a few times. Thomas turned sharply to Samuel. Was it the same young woman, the one you saw in the garden? Samuel signed emphatically. Yes. I didn't make the connection at first because she looked so different, so distressed. But it was definitely her. Her name was Lydia. Thomas stood abruptly, his tea forgotten. This changed everything. Lydia Whitmore had been secretly learning sign language, attending classes at the school for the deaf. She had deliberately concealed this from her family, or at least her family had never mentioned it to him. Why? Samuel, did she ever mention why she wanted to learn? Did she talk about her family or her life? Samuel's signs came more slowly now, as if he were searching his memory carefully. She was always very private. She said her cousin had recently lost her hearing due to illness, and she wanted to be able to communicate with her. She seemed sad about it, like it affected her deeply. She was a dedicated student, practiced hard. The last time I tutored her was about 3 weeks ago. Did she ever mention feeling threatened or afraid of anyone? No, nothing like that. But now that I think about it, she always seemed to be looking over her shoulder, like she was afraid of being seen at the school. I thought it was just because learning sign language might seem odd to her wealthy friends. Thomas paced the small parlor, his mind working through the new information. A wealthy young woman secretly learning sign language, then disappearing and being spotted at the very school where she learned, clearly in distress, with a mysterious older man who seemed to be controlling her movements. The ransom notes leading back to the school. It all connected. But how? There's something else, Clara said hesitantly. Samuel, do you want to tell them? Or should I? Samuel signed something to his sister, then to the room. Eleanor translated. There's a teacher at the school, Mr. Richard Ashford. He's one of the instructors for the evening classes. About a week ago, Samuel overheard him arguing with someone in his office. The door was partly open and Samuel happened to be walking past. He heard Mr. Ashford say something about the arrangement and keeping her safe until the time is right. Did you see who he was arguing with? Thomas asked urgently. No, Samuel signed. But it was definitely a man's voice, deep and commanding. Mr. Ashford sounded afraid of him. Thomas turned to Clara. Is the school open now? Could someone access the building at this hour? The main building locks at 8 o'clock, but Mr. Ashford lives in a small apartment on the 3rd floor. He's often there late into the evening, working on lesson plans or grading papers. Thomas made his decision. I need to visit the school tonight. Samuel, would you be willing to come with me and show me exactly where everything happened? The garden, the shadows, where you saw them. Samuel nodded eagerly, signing his willingness to help immediately. Margaret stepped forward, her maternal concern evident in every line of her face. Detective, it's nearly 10 o'clock, and it's still raining. Is this truly necessary tonight? Couldn't it wait until morning? Thomas understood her worry, but the urgency of the situation pressed upon him. Mrs. Brennan, Miss Whitmore has been missing for 4 days. Every hour that passes decreases our chances of finding her safely. I promise I'll keep Samuel safe, and we won't be long. Margaret looked to her daughter, who signed something reassuring to her brother before speaking aloud. Mother, Samuel wants to help. He's been troubled by what he saw ever since it happened. Let him do this. Clara's voice was stronger now, more confident than Thomas had yet heard it. I want to come too, Clara added, surprising everyone in the room, perhaps herself most of all. Samuel might need someone to help translate if the situation becomes complicated, and I know the school's layout as well as he does. I've picked him up from his classes many times. Thomas hesitated. Bringing civilians into a potentially dangerous investigation went against every protocol he knew. But Clara made a valid point about translation, and something told him that her presence might actually be beneficial. There was a steadiness beneath her shy exterior, a quiet strength that he was beginning to recognize. Very well, he agreed. But you both must promise to follow my instructions exactly. If I tell you to leave or to stay back, you do so immediately without question. Agreed. Both siblings nodded, and Samuel signed his solemn agreement. Eleanor stood as well, smoothing her skirts with decisive movements. And I'm certainly not staying behind while all of you venture out into the night. Thomas, before you argue, remember that I may be deaf, but I am not fragile, and I have every bit as much right to see this through as anyone else. Thomas recognized the futility of arguing with his mother when she used that tone. Besides, she was right. Of course, Mother. Your insights have been invaluable tonight. Margaret looked as though she wanted to protest further, but seemed to recognize that she was outnumbered. Instead, she fetched their coats and umbrellas, pressing a small oil lantern into Clara's hands. Be careful, all of you. Clara, you and Samuel watch out for each other. The quartet set out into the rainy Boston night, Thomas leading the way with Samuel beside him, while Clara and Eleanor followed close behind, sharing an umbrella and already deep in signed conversation. The streets were quieter now, the earlier evening bustle having given way to the stillness that settles over a city in the late hours. The Boston School for the Deaf occupied a large stone building on Beacon Street, its Gothic Revival architecture making it look somewhat like a small castle in the lamplight and rain. Tall windows reflected the glow of the gas street lamps, and a wrought iron fence surrounded the property, enclosing what Thomas could make out as a substantial garden, even in the darkness. Samuel led them to a side gate that he signed was usually left unlocked for the evening students who often stayed late to study. Indeed, when Thomas tried it, the gate swung open with a low creak that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet night. They moved through the garden, their footsteps muffled by wet grass and the steady patter of rain. Samuel guided them past flower beds and stone pathways until they reached an area where 3 massive oak trees stood like sentinels. Even in the darkness, Thomas could see how their thick trunks and spreading branches would cast deep shadows during the day. Samuel pointed to a stone bench positioned beneath the 3rd tree, signing to Eleanor, who translated quietly for Thomas. "This is where she was sitting, right here," and the man appeared from that direction, from the side of the building. Thomas examined the area carefully, using the oil lantern Clara had brought to illuminate the ground around the bench. The rain had washed away any footprints or other obvious evidence, but he noticed something else. Carved into the back of the bench, partially hidden by moss, were initials, LW plus JA. "Lydia Whitmore," Thomas murmured, tracing the letters with his finger. "But who is JA? He felt Clara move closer to see what he was looking at, and caught the subtle scent of lavender soap that clung to her despite the rain. "James Ashford," Clara said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. "He's Mr. Richard Ashford's younger brother. He assists with some of the classes occasionally, helps with administrative work. He's about 22 or 23, I think. Samuel, have you seen James recently?" Samuel shook his head, signing rapidly. Eleanor translated. "Not for at least 2 weeks. He usually helps with the Tuesday evening classes, but he hasn't been there. Mr. Ashford said his brother was traveling for business." Thomas felt another piece click into place. A secret romance between Lydia Whitmore and James Ashford would explain why she was learning sign language in secret, why she frequented the school, why she seemed to be looking over her shoulder. If her wealthy family disapproved of the match, they might have tried to keep it hidden. But then, where did the older man with the wolf-headed cane fit in? And why the cryptic ransom notes? "We need to speak with Richard Ashford," Thomas decided. "Samuel, you said he lives on the 3rd floor of the main building?" Samuel nodded and led them toward the imposing stone structure. The main entrance was indeed locked, but Samuel knew of a side door that the teachers used, which was secured only by a simple latch. They entered a dimly lit corridor that smelled of chalk dust, wood polish, and old books. The building was eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing off the high ceilings as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. Thomas noticed that the walls were decorated with student artwork and educational posters, many featuring the manual alphabet for sign language. It was clear that this was a place of learning and hope, which made the possibility of it being connected to a kidnapping all the more disturbing. They reached the 3rd floor, where a single door at the end of the hallway showed light beneath it. Thomas motioned for the others to stay back as he approached and knocked firmly on the door. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of a chair scraping against the floor and footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal a man in his late 40s with thinning brown hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent his days writing. He was dressed in shirt sleeves and a vest, clearly not expecting visitors at this hour. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice tinged with both confusion and concern as he took in the wet, bedraggled group in his hallway. Thomas produced his badge. "Mr. Richard Ashford, I'm Detective Thomas Aldridge with the Boston Police. I need to ask you some questions about Lydia Whitmore and your brother James." The color drained from Ashford's face so completely that Thomas thought the man might faint. He gripped the doorframe for support, his knuckles turning white. "Please," he said hoarsely. "Please come in. I've been expecting someone to come, though I prayed it wouldn't be necessary." They filed into a small but comfortable apartment, clearly the quarters of a dedicated academic. Books lined every available wall, papers covered a large desk by the window, and a modest fire burned in a small fireplace, providing warmth against the damp night. Ashford gestured for them to sit, though there weren't enough chairs for everyone. Thomas and Eleanor took the 2 available seats while Clara and Samuel stood close together near the door. Ashford poured himself a glass of brandy with shaking hands, not offering any to his guests. He took a long drink before speaking. "Detective, I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. I was trying to protect them both." "Start from the beginning, Mr. Ashford," Thomas said firmly, but not unkindly. "Tell me everything about Lydia Whitmore and your brother." Ashford sank into his chair as if the weight of his secrets was finally too much to bear. "James and Lydia met here, at the school, about 4 months ago. She came to learn sign language, said it was for a cousin, but James saw through that immediately. He has a gift for reading people. They fell in love almost instantly, both of them intelligent, passionate about learning, about helping others. James wants to dedicate his life to education for the deaf, and Lydia wanted to help him. But her family disapproved? Thomas prompted. More than disapproved. They forbade it absolutely. Gerald Whitmore is a proud man, detective, and ambitious. He has political aspirations, social climbing on his mind. The idea of his daughter marrying a poor teacher who works with the deaf, with the disadvantaged, it was intolerable to him. He told Lydia she would marry Cornelius Van Dorn, the railroad magnate's son, or she would be disowned entirely. Clara made a small sound of sympathy, and Thomas saw her unconsciously reach for Samuel's hand. This was a story that clearly resonated with her, perhaps reminded her of her own family's struggles. So they decided to run away together? Thomas asked. Yes, but they needed time to plan, to save money. James has been taking extra work wherever he could find it, and Lydia had some jewelry she could sell. They were going to leave Boston, start a new life where her father's influence couldn't reach them. But then, 4 days ago, everything went wrong. Ashford stood and began to pace, unable to remain still. Lydia's father discovered their plan somehow. I don't know how, perhaps a servant overheard something, or maybe he had her followed. He came here, to this very office, 3 days before Lydia disappeared. He threatened me, said if I didn't help him stop this romance, he would destroy the school. He's a wealthy man with powerful friends, detective. He could do it, close us down, ruin everything we've built here. What did he ask you to do? Thomas felt his jaw tightening with anger at the abuse of power. He wanted me to convince James to end the relationship, to tell him it was hopeless. But I know my brother, detective. He would never abandon Lydia, not for anything. So I tried to stall Whitmore, told him I would work on James, convince him gradually. I thought if I could just buy them enough time to get away. Ashford's voice broke with emotion. Eleanor had been following the conversation through a combination of lip reading and the signs that Clara was subtly making to help her understand. Now she signed a question that Thomas voiced aloud. Where is Lydia now? And where is your brother? Ashford's face crumpled. That's just it, detective. I don't know. 2 days after Whitmore's visit, James sent me a note saying he and Lydia were going ahead with their plan immediately, that they couldn't wait any longer. He asked me to tell no one, to say he'd gone traveling for business if anyone asked. That was 4 days ago, and I haven't heard from him since. When I saw in the papers that Lydia was reported missing, that her father claimed she'd been kidnapped, I didn't know what to believe or what to do. The ransom notes, Thomas said. Did James send them? I don't know. It doesn't seem like something he would do, but perhaps he thought it would buy them more time, throw her father off their trail. Or perhaps, Ashford's voice dropped to a whisper, perhaps Whitmore arranged them himself to cover up the fact that she left willingly. I've been tormented by not knowing, by the fear that I made everything worse by not going to the police immediately. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked garden below. The case was transforming before his eyes from a kidnapping into something far more complex, a tale of forbidden love and family control, of young people desperate to choose their own futures. But something still didn't fit. Mr. Ashford, Samuel saw Lydia in the garden 3 days ago with an older man, someone who seemed to be controlling her movements, a man with a walking stick with a wolf's head handle. Do you know who that might be? Ashford's expression shifted to confusion. 3 days ago? But that would be after they supposedly left together, and I don't know anyone matching that description. James certainly doesn't have a walking stick, and he's young, only 23. Samuel had been signing to Clara, who now spoke up hesitantly. Detective, may I say something? Samuel just reminded me of something he saw that day. He said there was a monogram on the carriage door, partially hidden by mud, but still visible. The letters C and V, intertwined in a fancy design. Thomas turned sharply. C.V. Cornelius Van Dorn, the man Lydia's father wanted her to marry. He looked at Ashford. Describe Van Dorn for me. I've never met him personally, but I've seen his picture in the society pages. He's in his 50s, very distinguished looking, gray hair. I believe he carries a walking stick, though I couldn't tell you what kind. The pieces were rearranging themselves again in Thomas's mind, forming a darker picture. What if Lydia and James never made it out of Boston? What if Van Dorn, with Whitmore's approval, or perhaps at his instigation, intercepted them? Lydia signing "Help me" to Samuel, the way she seemed resigned rather than willing, the ransom notes designed to make it look like a standard kidnapping while actually covering up something else entirely. Clara's voice was stronger now, indignation overcoming her shyness. You think they're holding her against her will? Forcing her to go through with the marriage to Van Dorn? It would explain everything, Thomas said grimly. The notes, the staged kidnapping, the sighting at the school. Perhaps they're keeping her somewhere until she agrees to cooperate, or until they can arrange a quiet wedding that appears voluntary. And James, he didn't finish the thought, but everyone in the room understood the implication. If Van Dorn and Whitmore were ruthless enough to kidnap Lydia, what might they have done to James? Ashford had gone pale again. My brother. Dear God, what have they done to my brother? Thomas placed a hand on the teacher's shoulder. We're going to find them both, Mr. Ashford, but I need your help. Think carefully. Is there any place Van Dorn might keep them? Any property he owns that's isolated or private? Ashford pressed his hands to his temples, thinking hard. Van Dorn owns the railroad, which means he has access to numerous properties. Stations, warehouses, even private railway cars. But there's one place, I remember reading about it in the business section. He recently acquired an estate outside the city in Brookline. It was described as very secluded, surrounded by woods, with its own private drive. He called it his sanctuary from the pressures of business. That's where we'll find them, Thomas said with conviction. He turned to Samuel and Clara. You've both been extraordinarily helpful tonight, but this is where I must ask you to step back. I need to gather my colleagues from the precinct and approach this properly. We're dealing with powerful men who won't hesitate to use their influence, and I won't put civilians at risk. Samuel signed something emphatically, and Clara translated with a small smile despite the gravity of the situation. He says that Lydia is his friend, that she was kind to him when others weren't, and he wants to help see this through. But he understands that he has to trust you to handle it from here. Eleanor signed to her son, and Thomas nodded. Mother says we should return everyone home safely and then proceed to the precinct to organize a proper response. She's right, of course. As they prepared to leave, Clara touched Thomas's arm hesitantly. When he turned to her, she was looking at him with those deep green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Detective Aldridge, please be careful. Men like Van Dorn don't surrender their plans easily, and if he's willing to kidnap Lydia, he's capable of worse. I will be careful, Thomas assured her, conscious of the warmth of her hand on his arm, even through the fabric of his coat. And thank you, Clara. You and Samuel have quite possibly saved 2 lives tonight. She blushed but didn't look away this time. I just want them to have the chance we all deserve to choose our own futures, to love whom we love. There was something in the way she said it, a wistfulness that made Thomas wonder about her own dreams and disappointments. Before he could explore the thought further, they were moving again, making their way back through the rain-soaked streets of Boston. Thomas escorted Clara, Samuel, and his mother back to the Brennan boarding house, where Margaret waited anxiously by the window. After ensuring everyone was safely inside and promising to send word once the situation was resolved, Thomas hailed a carriage and directed it first to his mother's home on Commonwealth Avenue, then to the police precinct on Berkeley Street. The precinct at midnight was a hive of controlled chaos. Officers changed shifts, drunks slept off their evening excesses in holding cells, and the night desk sergeant processed a steady stream of minor complaints and incidents. Thomas bypassed it all, heading directly to the office of Captain Edward Morrison, who he knew often worked late into the night. Morrison was a bear of a man, 60 years old, with a magnificent white mustache and the keen eyes of someone who had seen every trick in the criminal's handbook. He looked up from his paperwork as Thomas burst in, rainwater still dripping from his coat. Aldridge, you look like you've been swimming in the Charles. This had better be good to interrupt my reading of these magnificently boring budget reports. Thomas quickly laid out everything he had learned, speaking rapidly but precisely, the way Morrison preferred. The captain's expression grew progressively more serious as the story unfolded, and by the time Thomas finished, Morrison was on his feet, reaching for his own coat. Cornelius Van Dorn, Morrison said grimly. I've had my suspicions about that man for years. Too smooth, too careful, always just on the right side of the law. If he's involved in this, we need to move carefully but quickly. Men like him have lawyers who can tie up an investigation for months. We need to raid the Brookline estate tonight, sir. Every hour we delay puts both Lydia and James Ashford at greater risk. Morrison nodded, already moving toward the door. Agreed. But we do this by the book, Aldridge. I want a warrant, I want witnesses, and I want enough men to handle any resistance we might encounter. Van Dorn has private security, and they won't let us waltz in without proper authority." The next 2 hours were a masterclass in bureaucratic efficiency, as Morrison called in favors and pulled strings. A sympathetic judge was roused from his bed to sign the warrant. 6 officers were assembled and briefed. 2 carriages were commandeered, along with a police wagon in case arrests needed to be made. By 3 in the morning, they were rolling through the dark streets toward Brookline, the rain finally beginning to ease. Thomas rode in the lead carriage with Morrison and 2 other detectives, his mind racing through possible scenarios and complications. The Van Dorn estate loomed out of the darkness like something from a Gothic novel. High stone walls surrounded the property, and iron gates barred the entrance. A small gatehouse stood to one side, its windows dark. Morrison ordered the carriage to stop a short distance away, and the men proceeded on foot, using the trees along the road for cover. "No lights in the gatehouse," one of the detectives whispered. "Either there's no guard, or he's asleep." Thomas examined the gates more closely. They were locked, but the mechanism was visible through the bars. "I can pick this," he said quietly, producing a set of tools from his coat pocket, a skill he had acquired during his early years on the force that Morrison pretended not to know about. Within minutes, the gate swung open silently, and the men slipped through. The main house was perhaps 300 yards up a winding drive, a massive structure of stone and timber that spoke of both wealth and isolation. Lights burned in several windows on the ground floor, suggesting someone was awake despite the late hour. Morrison divided the men into 2 groups. One would approach from the rear to cut off any escape routes, while Thomas would lead the other group to the front entrance. They moved through the grounds with professional stealth, years of training making them nearly invisible in the pre-dawn darkness. As Thomas and his group neared the front of the house, they heard voices raised in argument coming from a room whose windows faced the gardens. Thomas signaled his men to wait and crept closer, positioning himself beneath the window where he could hear without being seen. "You cannot keep me here forever." It was a young woman's voice, filled with exhausted defiance. Lydia Whitmore. Thomas was certain of it. "My dear, you misunderstand the situation entirely." This voice was older, smooth and cultured, but with an edge of steel beneath the politeness. "I am not keeping you here. I am protecting you from making the gravest mistake of your young life. In time, you will thank me. I will never thank you for separating me from James. Where is he? What have you done with him? If you've hurt him, I swear You'll what, my dear? You have no power here, no options. Your father and I have made arrangements. In 3 days we will be married in a private ceremony. Your father will announce that you were found safe after your terrible ordeal, that we fell in love during your recovery, and that we chose to wed quickly and quietly to avoid the scandal. It's all very neat." "It's all very insane." Lydia's voice broke with emotion. "I don't love you. I love James." "I will always love James." There was a long silence. Then Van Dorn spoke again, his voice colder now. "Then you had better hope young Mr. Ashford learns to be more cooperative. His continued comfort depends entirely on your behavior, Lydia. Surely you don't want him to suffer because of your stubbornness." Thomas had heard enough. He signaled his men and moved to the front door. Morrison and the rear group would have heard the signal, 3 sharp whistles that sounded like a night bird, and would be moving into position as well. The front door was locked, but Thomas didn't bother with picking it this time. "Police, open this door immediately or we will force entry." There was a moment of shocked silence from within, then the sound of rapid footsteps and confused shouting. Thomas counted to 5, then nodded to Officer Patterson, the largest man on the force, who hit the door with his shoulder. The lock gave way on the second impact, and they poured into the house. The entrance hall was magnificent, all marble and dark wood, with a sweeping staircase and crystal chandeliers. But Thomas had no time to appreciate the architecture. He followed the sound of voices to a room off to the left, a library or study, where he found Cornelius Van Dorn standing protectively in front of a young woman who could only be Lydia Whitmore. She was exactly as Samuel had described, blonde, beautiful, and currently looking at the police with an expression of desperate hope. Van Dorn himself matched the description as well, distinguished and well-dressed, with a walking stick propped against a nearby chair. Thomas could see the wolf's head handle gleaming in the lamplight. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Van Dorn demanded, though Thomas could see the calculation in his eyes. the mind already working on how to spin this situation to his advantage. Captain Morrison entered behind Thomas, warrant in hand. "Cornelius Van Dorn, I have a warrant to search these premises and to investigate allegations of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. Step away from Miss Whitmore, please." "Kidnapping? This is preposterous. Miss Whitmore is here as my guest. Voluntarily, I might add. She came to me seeking protection from an unfortunate entanglement with an unsuitable young man. Didn't you, my dear?" Before Van Dorn could continue his performance, Lydia stepped forward, her voice ringing with clarity and courage. "That is a lie. I was taken by force from the train station 4 days ago, separated from James Ashford, and brought here against my will. Mr. Van Dorn has held me prisoner, threatening to harm James if I tried to escape or call for help. The young woman is clearly distraught," Van Dorn said smoothly. "She doesn't know what she's saying. Perhaps the stress of her situation has—" "Where is James Ashford?" Thomas interrupted, his voice hard. "If you've harmed him, things will go much worse for you than they already will." Van Dorn's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lydia's eyes widened. "He's here. James is here somewhere in this house. Van Dorn's men locked him in the cellar. Please, you have to find him." Morrison immediately dispatched officers to search the house. Thomas stayed with Van Dorn, watching the older man's facade of civility crumble as he realized his carefully constructed plan was falling apart. Within minutes, shouting came from below, and 2 officers emerged from a door that led to the cellar, supporting between them a young man who could barely stand. James Ashford was alive, but clearly had been through an ordeal. His face was bruised, his clothes torn and dirty, and he moved as if his ribs pained him. But when he saw Lydia, his entire expression transformed with joy and relief. "Lydia!" he called out, his voice hoarse but strong. "James!" She tried to run to him, but Van Dorn grabbed her arm. Without thinking, Thomas moved forward and firmly removed Van Dorn's hand from her. "Don't touch her," Thomas said quietly, but with such authority that Van Dorn stepped back. Lydia rushed to James, and they embraced with the desperate intensity of 2 people who had thought they might never see each other again. There were tears, whispered words of love and reassurance, and a tenderness that made even the hardened police officers look away to give them a moment of privacy. Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs. "Cornelius Van Dorn, you are under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy. You have the right to—" "You're making a terrible mistake," Van Dorn interrupted, though his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "Do you have any idea who I am? The connections I have? I'll have your badges for this. Perhaps you should have considered that before you decided to play God with 2 young people's lives." Morrison replied calmly, securing the handcuffs. "Take him to the wagon." As Van Dorn was led away, still protesting his innocence and making threats, Thomas approached Lydia and James. The young couple were still holding each other, though James was now sitting in a chair, clearly exhausted. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Ashford, I'm Detective Thomas Aldridge. Are either of you in need of immediate medical attention?" James shook his head weakly. "I'll be all right. They didn't feed me much, and Van Dorn's men roughed me up a bit when I wouldn't stop demanding to see Lydia, but nothing's broken. We'll have a doctor examine you both regardless," Thomas said firmly, "and I'll need detailed statements from each of you about what happened." Lydia looked up at him with red-rimmed but grateful eyes. "How did you find us?" "My father, he said he had called in the police, but I wasn't sure if anyone was actually looking, or if this was all part of his plan with Van Dorn. Your father did report you missing, though I suspect his motives were not entirely pure," Thomas said carefully. "But you were found because of the clues you left, the notes that led me to the school, and because of the bravery and quick thinking of Samuel Brennan." "Samuel?" Lydia's face lit up. "Samuel helped you? Oh, thank God. He saw me that day in the garden, didn't he? I tried to signal him, but Van Dorn appeared so quickly. He saw and he remembered, and he told me everything. He and his sister Clara were instrumental in solving this case." James looked up with interest despite his exhaustion. "Clara Brennan? Samuel's sister? She works at Murphy's Café, doesn't she? Samuel talks about her constantly, how hard she works to support the family." "Yes, that's her," Thomas said, and felt a warmth spread through his chest at the mention of her name. Over the next hour, order was gradually restored to the chaotic scene. A doctor arrived and examined both James and Lydia, pronouncing them bruised and exhausted but fundamentally sound. Additional officers arrived to secure the property and gather evidence, And most dramatically, Gerald Whitmore himself appeared, summoned by a message Morrison had sent. Whitmore rushed into the house demanding to see his daughter, full of performative concern and relief. But when he saw Lydia standing hand in hand with James, his expression darkened considerably. "Lydia, thank God you're safe. Now come away from that man and—" "No, Father." Lydia's voice was quiet, but absolutely firm. "I will not come away from James. Not now, not ever. You may disown me if you choose, cut me off without a cent, but you cannot make me stop loving him. Lydia, be reasonable. This man has nothing to offer you. No money, no position, no prospects. You would throw away everything for him?" "Not everything, Father. Just the things that don't matter." She looked up at James with such love that even Thomas, cynical from years of seeing the worst of humanity, felt moved by it. "James offers me partnership, respect, a shared purpose in helping others. He offers me the chance to be myself, not just an ornament in your political ambitions. That's worth more than all the money in Boston." Whitmore looked as if he wanted to argue further, but Morrison stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you have a conversation with your daughter at a more appropriate time. Right now, I have questions for you about your relationship with Cornelius Van Dorn and what you knew about his plans." The older man's face went pale. "I knew nothing about any kidnapping. Van Dorn told me he would court Lydia properly, convince her that he was a better match than this penniless teacher. I never authorized force or imprisonment." "Then you won't mind accompanying us to the precinct to make a formal statement," Morrison said, in a tone that made it clear this was not a request. As the sun began to rise over the Van Dorn estate, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas found himself standing on the front steps, watching the various carriages depart. Van Dorn was heading to jail, Whitmore to the precinct for questioning, and Lydia and James to the hospital for a more thorough examination, though they had insisted on traveling together. Morrison joined him on the steps, lighting his pipe with satisfaction. "Good work, Aldridge. That was as neat a piece of detective work as I've seen in years. Following the clues, finding the witnesses, putting together a puzzle when half the pieces were deliberately obscured." "I had help, sir. A great deal of help from people who had no obligation to get involved but chose to anyway." Morrison smiled knowingly around his pipe. "Ah, yes, the Brennan siblings, particularly the sister, if I'm reading between the lines correctly. A young woman who works as a waitress but speaks sign language and has the courage to walk into a detective's investigation at midnight. Sounds like someone with character." Thomas felt his ears growing warm. "She's remarkable, sir, though I've only known her a short time." "Sometimes a short time is all you need," Morrison said sagely. "My wife and I knew we would marry after 3 days of acquaintance. 52 years later, I still think I made the right decision. Don't let a good woman slip away because you think you need more time to be certain, Aldridge. Life's too short, and happiness is too rare." As they returned to the precinct to handle the mountains of paperwork that would follow, Thomas found his thoughts returning again and again to Clara, to the way she had overcome her shyness to help strangers, the dedication she showed to her brother, the kindness in her eyes when she signed with his mother. He had encountered many people in his years as a detective, but few had made the impression Clara had in just one evening. 2 days later, Thomas found himself back at Murphy's Café, officially to take additional statements from Clara and Samuel about what they had witnessed, but truthfully because he couldn't stop thinking about her. He had timed his arrival for the evening, knowing she would be working. The café was moderately busy, and Clara was moving between tables with her characteristic quiet efficiency. She hadn't seen him yet, and Thomas took a moment to simply watch her, noting the grace with which she navigated the crowded room, the small kindnesses she showed to each customer. When she finally noticed him, her face lit up in a way that made his heart skip. She approached his table, her usual nervousness tempered by what looked like genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Detective Aldridge," she said softly, then signed the greeting as well, perhaps out of habit. "I was hoping you might come by. We've been following the case in the newspapers. They say Miss Whitmore and Mr. Ashford are going to be married." "Next month," Thomas confirmed, gesturing for her to sit if she had a moment. She glanced around the cafe, then slipped into the seat across from him. "And your mother? How is she?" "I've been thinking about her, hoping she wasn't too distressed by that night's events." The fact that Clara's first thought was for his mother's well-being told Thomas everything he needed to know about her character. "Mother is wonderful, actually. She hasn't stopped talking about you. She says you have a gift for making people feel seen and valued. Clara blushed beautifully. That's very kind of her. I only treated her the way anyone should be treated, which is precisely why it was so meaningful, Thomas said gently. Most people don't extend that courtesy, especially to those who are different from themselves. You did, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. They talked for several minutes, about the case's resolution, about Samuel's excitement at being part of something important, about Eleanor's delight at having made a new friend. And then, gathering his courage, Thomas asked the question that had been on his mind since that rainy night. Clara, I was wondering if you might permit me to call on you. Properly, I mean. Not as a detective seeking a statement, but as a man who would very much like to know you better. Her eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment Thomas feared he had misread the situation entirely. But then she smiled, that radiant smile that transformed her whole face, and nodded. I would like that very much, Detective Aldridge. Thomas, he corrected gently. Please call me Thomas. Thomas, she repeated, as if testing how his name felt in her mouth. And you must call me Clara, of course. Over the following weeks, Thomas became a regular fixture at Murphy's Café and the Brennan boarding house. He and Clara took walks through Boston Common, attended concerts in the park, and spent long evenings in the Brennan parlor, conversing about everything from literature to social reform to their dreams for the future. Eleanor and Clara formed a fast friendship, spending hours in signed conversation that seemed to energize them both. Samuel, thrilled to have played a part in solving a real case, became something of a younger brother to Thomas, always eager to hear about detective work and police procedures. Margaret Brennan, initially cautious about her daughter becoming involved with a police detective, was won over by Thomas's respectful courtship and his genuine appreciation for Clara's unique qualities. She confided to her daughter that any man who could see past Clara's shyness to the remarkable woman beneath was worth considering. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas found himself falling more deeply in love with Clara with each passing day. She was teaching him sign language, patiently correcting his clumsy finger positions, and laughing at his mistakes in a way that made them feel like private jokes rather than failures. He was introducing her to parts of Boston she had never seen, encouraging her dreams of perhaps one day opening a school where deaf and hearing children could learn together. On a snowy December evening, 6 months after they first met, Thomas took Clara to the Boston Common. They walked along the lamplit paths, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Clara, he began, his heart pounding despite having faced down armed criminals with less trepidation. I need to tell you something. She looked up at him, her beautiful eyes reflecting the lamplight. What is it, Thomas? I love you, he said simply. I think I've loved you since that first night, when you signed to my mother and made her feel human again. You have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known, and you make me want to be a better man. I know I'm not much of a prize, just a detective with modest means and irregular hours, but if you'll have me, I promise to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you've made me. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, but she was smiling as she signed and spoke simultaneously. You are everything I never dared to dream of, Thomas. Kind, honorable, strong, and gentle all at once. I love you too, with all my heart. He kissed her then, soft and sweet as the snow fell around them like a blessing. And in that moment, Thomas understood that the case of Lydia Whitmore had given him far more than professional satisfaction. It had given him Clara, and through her, it had shown him that the greatest mysteries weren't always crimes to be solved, but rather the unexpected ways that love could enter a life and transform it completely. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the same church where Lydia and James had wed months earlier. Samuel served as Thomas's best man, signing his toast with such enthusiasm that everyone laughed, even those who couldn't understand the words. Eleanor cried happy tears throughout the ceremony and told anyone who would listen that her son had found the perfect partner. Thomas and Clara made their home in a comfortable brownstone near the north end, close enough that Samuel and Margaret could visit easily. Clara continued her work with deaf students, eventually opening the integrated school she had dreamed of, while Thomas rose through the ranks of the police department, always remembering that the best detective work often came from listening to the voices others overlooked. And every year on the anniversary of the night they met, Thomas and Clara returned to Murphy's Café, sitting at the same table where Clara had first signed to Eleanor, where a simple act of kindness had changed all their lives forever. They would hold hands across the table, signing I love you to each other in the language that had brought them together, grateful for the mystery that had revealed the greatest truth of all, that sometimes the most extraordinary thing we can do is simply to see each other, truly see each other, and choose love.